Today, a cabinet reshuffle. What does that mean for you? How can we tackle antisocial behaviour? And are military cuts leaving us defenceless? This is Politics Live. With me today, Conservative MP Catherine Fletcher, SNP MP Dave Dugan, journalist and author Paul Mason and Alex Phillips, former Brexit Party MEP and now with the Reform UK Party. Today, the Prime Minister reorganises his top team. This man is the new Conservative Party chairman. We'll have the latest from our correspondent. But will reshaping Whitehall really help people with the cost of living? Also today...
At one point there was a knife fight on the stairwell, which ended up with people being stabbed.
Antisocial behaviour is blighting many of our communities. How can we tackle it? Britain is sending tanks and artillery to Ukraine, but is that harming our own defences?
We sent 30 big artillery guns, but there is no order in place to replace them.
30 years of gradually building, till we get independence over 50% and then throw it away.
Has the row over the SNP's gender reform plans damaged the campaign for Scottish independence? Let's start with BP and figures. Record profits. They've more than doubled to £23 billion. We reported last week too about Shell. You can see this headline here. We'll talk about that particular note in a moment. BP scales back climate targets as profits hit record. My opening question, though, to the panel is, does it matter, Catherine, that they've got record profits?
It matters. I mean, they're eye-watering sums, and it matters hugely because it's a function of what's been going on in Eastern Europe and with Putin's use of fossil fuels. I think people need to understand that BP's a global company, so only about 10% of its profits come from the UK, but they're subject to not only the UK corporation tax, but also the windfall tax as well at 35%. So we're getting hundreds of millions of pounds in the exchequer from this to devote back to climate change. Do those record profits matter?
Yes, indeed they do. And one of the key metrics out of BP's figures today are the $14 billion in dividends and buybacks, and the Treasury should be taking a very careful view at the way that big oil can manage to do those types of financial manoeuvres, because it's a zero-sum game. The crisis in domestic and commercial energy bills is the same cost that's manifesting itself in profits, not directly with exactly the same energy companies, but the overall enterprise. The massive profits are a consequence of the massive costs, and government needs to get a grip. So would you like to see more taxes levied against oil and gas companies? Particularly on the share buybacks, which is a particular feature of energy enterprise, and it's even if it's time-bound, it's time for a look at that to make sure that the Exchequer gets access to those funds to the benefit of not just domestic energy users, but also businesses who are facing real challenges. There's a difficult juxtaposition, isn't there, with soaring energy bills for people here and in other parts of Europe. Catherine's point that they are profiteering out of a war, does it matter?
I'm not sure that's exactly what you said, but I would say it. They are, and of course, they get hit with a windfall tax. They pay corporation tax above the normal rate.
It's a high windfall tax.
But, hey presto, in the years between 2015 and 2021, neither BP nor Shell really paid tax. They had tax-negative positions. So the taxpayer, since we can't nationalise them, we could think about golden shares to direct their investments into the green energy. But since we can't nationalise them, I mean, I think windfall tax higher and bigger.
Higher than 75%.
It's just you need to be taking quite a lot of money off. It's a windfall. Of course, it will go away if we hope the Ukraine war one day goes away.
Alex, in terms of that headline, that they're scaling back their investment in green energy, that was the sort of quid pro quo.
Well, that was supposed to be exactly the trigger to stop them having to pay the windfall tax. I think my problem with the whole setup of the energy market, if you could call it that, is the level of intervention that's gone on, which has actually left the consumer and the taxpayer carrying a lot of the burden and never getting any of the perks. And actually that balance should be shifted back to the big energy companies themselves. They should have been told, you know, you've got to stick to 2021 prices when you're selling to the suppliers. If they had done that, there'd be no need for the windfall tax. And frankly, as terrible as the optics are, creating a model for windfall taxes, I think, sets a very dangerous precedent.
All right, we're going to talk about the reshuffle. It was expected. It has unfolded this morning. We're going to talk to the BBC's chief political correspondent in Downing Street, Nick Eardley. There he is, with the famous black door opening and shutting behind him, as it has over the last few hours. But first of all, let me just give you the headlines. They're not new faces. There's been a sort of reshuffle, literally, of the decks. Here, Greg Hands is now the Conservative Party chairman. Big gap, replacing Nadeem Zahawi, who was sacked. Grant Shapps is now Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary because the Business Department has been split up into three. Michelle Donnellan goes from being the Culture, Media and Sports Secretary to the Science, Innovation and Technology Secretary, and Kemi Badenoch, who was Trade Secretary, is now Business and Trade Secretary. Lucy Fraser comes in as the Culture, Media and Sport Secretary. Nick Eardley, your thoughts and comments on this reshuffle?
Hi, Jo. It feels a bit like classic Sunak, doesn't it? There was the bit that was forced. He's brought in a safe pair of hands as Tory chairman, pardon the pun. And then he's moved about a lot of government departments, a few tweaks to the machinery of government. I think it's about trying to say to us all, look, these are my strategic priorities, trying to maintain some energy security, trying to make things like science and technology a key part of the economic plan. But here's the question, is it going to be enough to capture the political imagination? So often we stand here in Downing Street on reshuffle day and there's some big drama, some new faces coming in to try and spice up the team. I suppose it's a bit early for Rishi Sunak to be doing that, but the big fear that some Tory MPs have had over the past few months since he took over is that there's a lack of big political narrative, a big vision to sell to the country, particularly with the local elections coming up in May. I just wonder if they'll feel in any way comforted by what's happened this morning.
Nick Eardley, thank you very much. Catherine Fletcher, the two priorities, in fact, the first one is to cut inflation in half and alongside that, help with the cost of living. What difference will this new Department of Energy, Security and Net Zero do to help people?
Well, I actually think it pertains to the conversation we've been previously. You know, let's focus in on nuclear, let's focus in on renewables. Let's make sure that we're actually solving some of the long-term problems. So I was part of the people that were really pushing for the onshore wind consultation that's been launched. You know, communities getting money back for energy generation in their communities. I think that's really important. And actually, when you start to ask questions of Whitehall, you are going to lots of different places. And I think to anybody can understand, putting an important priority in one bucket so you know whose door to knock on, I think that's really important.
Do you think people's bills will come down anytime soon?
I think it will do, because that will be part of what drives halving inflation. I think we need to push and keep going. And it's nice to see the global market separating. And I think we need to keep going on nuclear energy, nuclear regeneration. But just as an aside, just on that panel, isn't it fabulous to see three really talented Tory women kind of getting new big departments in the cabinet? You know, it's party.
You're pleased about that?
I'm really chuffed. I'm well done to all of them.
Well, we'll judge on delivery, of course, as always. Dave, do you welcome it in the same way, this new Energy Security and Net Zero Department?
Well, I certainly welcome three women getting top jobs in any government. I can agree with Catherine on that. But, you know, of those 5 high-profile appointments, it's interesting, isn't it, in terms of an analysis of the United Kingdom, that only 2 of them will have a passing reference to Scotland in terms of trade with Kemi Badenoch and energy with Grant Shapps. And one of the key things that I'd like to see Grant Shapps get to grips with is the entirely dysfunctional energy market in the United Kingdom. I'd like to see him lay it on the line to Ofgem that they're actually going to have to get some sort of dynamic intervention to their way of operating and their way of regulating the energy market. The absolutely unjust surcharges that energy generators in Scotland have to pay compared with energy generators in the south of England is holding back the transition to net zero.
I think Dave's got a really good point there. I mean, sorting out the national grid and allowing new connections to come on, either it be a more coordinated way from offshore wind or onshore wind, that's really important. You know, we've got projects reporting grid slots that can't happen until 2032. Putting a focus on that ultimately brings down inflation, brings down bills and solves energy security for us.
Right. Is it going to bring down bills for people?
It's amazing, isn't it? You've only been in power 13 years to discover the fact that the energy market's dysfunctional. Grant Shapps has one job now, and that concerns both people's bills and the security of the country. And that is to deploy nuclear, wind and solar power as rapidly as possible. But to do that, the Conservatives are going to have to rip up the planning system. This 7-year wait for joining the national grid isn't just because the national grid is inefficient, although it may be. It's the fact that you have to build the transformers, and as soon as you put your transformer or your big cable planning application in, I think the average for that is something like 11 years.
I
your
agree.
party, it's your party, I'm afraid, in rural England that is the big driver of objections to the planning system. So I think we need to
I agree. I
the
think
planning
we need
system.
to separate housing planning from infrastructure
Absolutely.
planning. This is not government policy. This is me riffing, but I genuinely believe it's one of the biggest constrictions on growth. I think you're right, but I would say that I don't think tying it to local communities. Community consent is key here, and that's what's powerful about the onshore wind consultation.
What about net zero? I mean, it says energy security and net zero, Secretary. There might be people watching who think maybe my bills are going to go up.
Well, what a contradiction in terms. I mean, if you look at our energy policy over the past couple of decades, this drive for net zero has made us net poorer. We've exported carbon emissions to other developing countries, and carbon doesn't know what a national border is. At the same time as exporting our own carbon emissions, we've exported our industrial policy, we've exported our potential prosperity, we've exported our geopolitical leverage. It's about time we got real and got pragmatic when it comes to how we do energy in the UK, and actually understand that if we continue to self-flagellate by focusing constantly on targets, net zero targets, while other countries are flouting it, frankly, we're going to be poorer and we're going to be weaker.
Dave?
So it's not an act in self-flagellation. It's addressing the climate emergency, and the need to have a green revolution in our energy generation is not what's made us poorer. Leaving the European Union and the single market is what's made us poorer. Slamming the door on free movement of people is what's made us poorer and what's made our services go into a critical state of under-supply of labour. So, the idea, and incidentally, Catherine, I would gently push back on nuclear being the answer. It has enormous capital costs up front, and it's actually extremely high carbon in its construction.
I think nuclear is a big part of net zero. Nuclear is a big part of green jobs and skills and tech. So tell people in Moorside or Sellafield or Springfield or Anglesey or Trawsfynydd or Wilver that net zero nuclear isn't a jobs provider and a skills provider, and I think that's scoff. But do you think there's any chance of the Scottish Government changing its policy on nuclear? Because to me it seems insane that there's a UK domestic capability there that can really generate and lower people's bills, and you guys are opposed to it.
I genuinely think there's no evidence that nuclear energy has lowered people's bills. When it came to pass in the 1950s and 60s, we were told, or I wasn't, but older people were told that it would be too cheap to meter. Well, that never came to pass, and that doesn't include the decommissioning costs, which are eye-watering.
To be fair, my father's worked in that industry.
And where does the waste go?
Drigg.
A hole in the ground.
But it's a sophisticated facility. But why would you not want clean baseload energy to help bring people's bills down?
And we'll do that with hydrogen and pumped storage.
I mean, when we see hydrogen, I'm a supporter of hydrogen, but when we see it work, when it's there at scale, there's a big project in northwest England. I went to COP26.
It's fantastic, isn't it?
To try and sell that to people there, but with the best will in the world, it'll take some time. I think look, there's a consensus. There's a consensus in Westminster around nuclear, nuclear, wind. We should do some more onshore wind and solar. And solar is the cheapest energy, and it does two things for the people you're trying to appeal to here. And I'm glad this politics is more or less dead. The kind of politics of, well, it is the politics of climate.
Dead.
Yes, the politics of climate denial.
I wasn't talking about climate denial. I'm talking about geopolitical practicality and pragmatism.
It's the cheapest energy in the world.
When the sun shines.
Solar.
When the sun shines, you do need a base load of something.
You need a base load of nuclear, you need wind, you need solar.
Paul, just on solar panels, sorry, Joe.
No.
I think Alex does have a point in that I think 85% or 90% of the solar panel manufacturing capability is still in China.
Right.
Fine, let's make some here.
So I don't think there's a silver bullet to this. And actually, there are some innovative companies in Lancashire that are having a look at that. But we need to be strategic about how we bring this onshore manufacturing back.
And how do they feel about the Conservative government and Conservative ministers continually harping on about banning the development of solar on low-grade farmland?
No, high-grade farmland.
Sorry, it's
Food security is important.
Do you want to ban solar panels on 3B land? Because if you do, that'll kill the solar energy.
I tell you what I do want. I want solar panels on every Amazon warehouse. I want solar panels on every business unit.
That's not an answer to the question. That's not where the developments are going to be.
Well, it depends on what we need to happen, and you come back to community consent.
Can I just ask, are you comfortable with oil and gas, new oil and gas licences being granted?
So, for me, the operative word in net zero is net. The implication that we're going to not use oil or gas any time in the near future is not realistic. It's not a cogent point of view.
Not use it, but new licences.
When you accept that you are going to consume oil and gas in a net zero, within net zero parameters, it's very much better to make sure that the jobs and the revenue for that oil and gas is receipted as close to the source of consumption as possible, both for the environment and for fiscal reasons and employment opportunity reasons. And we must really ensure...
Is that what your Green partners think as well?
I can't speak for the Greens and I'm not in the Scottish Government, but it's really important that Scotland's had more than its fair share of deindustrialisation in this union, and we cannot allow that to happen to the northeast of Scotland. But we should go full speed ahead with the green revolution. And incidentally, just to Paul's point, there isn't consensus about nuclear in the UK Parliament. There's consensus between English parties in the UK Parliament about nuclear.
Fine. Let's build them in England.
And what about the oil and gas licence? Do you accept Dave's point that actually there's got to be some sort of continuity until there's consistency when it comes to renewables?
Absolutely. I think that's not the big problem facing Grant Shapps. The problem facing Grant Shapps is how do you unblock the planning system? Yes, let's forget housing. How do you unblock the infrastructure planning system? The biggest solar farm in this country is 70 megawatts in North Wales. We need 67 of them between now and 2030 to meet the government's own target. How do we do that when the average... I mean, the planning is a nightmare. So let's have some cross-party consensus about it. It's going to be hard. It's hard. Yes, for local communities. Sometimes their objections are sometimes overridden. But the planet is entering a chaos cycle. And we have to stop climate change. And
I think the challenge for all of us as politicians, I was Alok Sharma's PPS I had 2 weeks in a glamorous porter cabin in Glasgow and watching the world debate this. One, the UK is miles ahead of less of the countries. You would see people privately sidle up and go, how have you done it? But also the fact that we need to have a dynamic debate about solving it in multiple different ways and, crucially, not scaring people and telling them that we're going to take your gas boiler off you. We're not.
I know you want to carry on talking about this particular subject. We'll come back to it on another programme because we're going to talk about something else, antisocial behaviour. And one story covered by the Politics South East reporter Marcella Whittingdale in Brighton, where residents were successful in addressing the issue on their estate. Let's have a look.
Well, you're just frightened, you're petrified. They were everywhere around here.
So brazen about it. It was at least sometimes 5, 6, 7 times a day.
Drug dealing and antisocial behaviour has plagued the Craven Vale estate. Fights, break-ins and criminal damage left residents feeling threatened and unsafe, with some too frightened to leave their homes after dark.
At one point, one of the flats nearby, it was a sort of a central meeting point for various drug gangs. And at one point there was a knife fight on the stairwell, which ended up with people being stabbed.
When you're walking down the road, you're looking behind your back all the time. You hear they got knives and they carry around with them in their pockets. I wanted to move. I was on the verge of moving. Yeah, it got to me just like that. I said, I can't put up with it anymore.
But there's been a change at Craven Vale. Residents decided enough was enough and kick-started a comprehensive action plan. It included pushing for good street lighting, gathering video evidence for police and publicly holding Brighton and Hove City Council to account again and again.
The government guidelines, and they're now finally being accepted by Brighton, is that you should put the victim first and the perpetrator second. But Brighton were doing it the other way around. Their aim was to keep that person in their flat rather than to protect the people around him. The final, not eviction or at least transfer away from this area only took place about 4 weeks ago. But already people are feeling much more relaxed, able to come out, walk their dogs without fear. And there has been quite a bit of fear around.
The Tenants Association also works hard to bring residents together with a timetable of activities like the Tuesday Morning Cafe, a warm, safe space for a chat or for problems to be flagged up and passed on. Sussex Police say they've upped patrols in Craven Vale, identified and arrested prolific offenders and worked hard to safeguard vulnerable residents. Jo Coburn, the local police community support officer.
I do go to some of the residents' meetings at the community centre, but we also, as PCSOs in the whole of Brighton, do a lot of patrolling in high visibility on foot in our ward areas, so that it gives us time to really stop and talk to people and take the time to understand what's going on in those neighbourhoods.
Brighton and Hove City Council say they're legally required to give people a chance to improve their behaviour before evicting them, and that they've also changed how they deal with antisocial behaviour experienced by council tenants. But residents say making Craven Vale a better place to live should never have been such a battle, though their new sense of safety makes it more than worth it.
You saw and heard Alan Cook there in the film. He joins us now. He's of the Craven Vale Tenants Association. Welcome to you, Alan. We heard some of the issues. What was the worst issue in terms of antisocial behaviour for you and the residents?
The problem with the estate is that most of the one-bedroom flats are clustered into stairwells. So there's one stairwell and it serves 6 flats. And all you need is one troublemaker in that flat, in that stairwell, and the other 5 are too frightened to do anything about it. They are continually threatened. And it took some time for them to actually come out and tell us in the community association what was wrong and what needed to be done. The worst case recently was one who was put in by the council. Within the first 3 weeks, he started, losing control of himself. He was attacking his neighbours, breaking windows, crashing doors and so on.
Right, so, I mean, but it sounds like you did some quite simple things to actually change the whole feel of the estate.
Well, yes, we complain and complain and complain. So the council have got thousands of emails on this. We also did a petition. It only took 10 days to get 75 names on that petition. And when you bear in mind that people have got to hand in their names and their addresses, it showed just how much people were willing things to change. So that was one. And secondly, we went back to the Home Office and checked through all the legalities of what they should be doing in Brighton, and we found that they weren't. So we confronted them with the evidence and basically force them to change. Now, we're not the only ones in Brighton who are suffering. We know others are suffering, but we just decided with video evidence to push and push and push.
And there were things like street lighting, better street lighting, perhaps better surveillance. Those sorts of things helped too.
Yes, I mean, we were suffering from people, from the drug dealers, breaking the lights, so we had to keep replacing them. We had one resident who was extremely good on video, and the video would be taken of a drug dealer coming down from London, visiting the flat. That would be with the police within 5 minutes, and the police would be around within 10 minutes. And I think we had 15 arrests of non-residents, most of whom were charged with drug offences.
Well, Alan, stay with us and listen to the discussion. Catherine, starting with you, I'm sure you've heard stories like this. What do you make of the sort of people power of the residents here? They had to push the local authority, they had to push the Home Office, and then finally something was done, particularly about removing, in some instances, people who were involved in a lot of antisocial behaviour.
My initial reaction is give Alan a medal. I mean, you know, community activists like that, they really are the beating heart of communities. And I think he's absolutely spot on in identifying it, in that it is about leadership and focus, and that's what he's shown in his community. Oh, you can see Alan. Alan, brilliant stuff. Tenner's in the post. Oh, well, it's not, but you know what I mean. But we've got something similar going on in Lancashire, where the police have completely restructured themselves, neighbourhood teams. I was at an antisocial behaviour conference the other day, and the role of communities and the local councils and the police and the PCSOs working together to put focus on a problem. I think we have been guilty in the past of being a bit too softly with people that blight people's lives. Now, that's not to say everybody should be treated the same, but especially, for example, if young people are committing antisocial behaviour, sometimes a criminal charge is appropriate, as well as diversionary activities and support and letting the parents know.
Right.
Finding the balance.
Well, what about in Scotland? Because there is an issue. Perhaps people are indulging in antisocial behaviour, but they may be vulnerable themselves. Do you think they should be treated more harshly?
I don't think anybody should be treated harshly. I think everybody should be treated fairly. And you're absolutely right that vulnerability manifests itself in a range of different ways, and all local authorities have a statutory obligation to house people. That's all fine and that's all good, but quite often it falls to people like Alan to highlight the actual compound consequences of what's happening, where somebody's been placed here or somebody's been placed there, on the actual welfare of other residents and tenants on the estate. And I think, I don't know what's happened in Brighton and Hove, but certainly before I came into Parliament, I was a local councillor as well, and we used to work very closely with community wardens who did a tremendous amount to make sure that people felt, first of all, reassured about behaviour that was sub-threshold but still wasn't very pleasant, and then made proper interventions when more serious behaviour was there to support residents.
I mean, you'll remember the phrase, sorry to cut you off there, you'll remember the phrase, Paul, zero tolerance. I think Rudy Giuliani did it in New York, this idea that you tackle what is sort of low-lying or starts as low-lying antisocial behaviour but can develop. Is that still appropriate now in the way that Alan and his colleagues have done?
I think this is a great example, and there's a report out today from the Conservative think tank, Onward, that basically says, if we call it levelling up, improving the lives of poor communities, and tackling antisocial behaviour can be really key to that. Now, what I think this shows is that there's two parts to the answer. There's the micro institutions that, like this community association that they run, like diverting police resources to what's called hotspot policing. There's that. But at the end of the day, some of these things are crimes. Carrying a knife is a crime. Intimidation is a crime. Breaking a street light is a crime. And we've had cuts in police numbers, and councils have lost it. I'm sorry, we've had cuts in police numbers, and we've had councils losing a quarter of their budget over the last decade.
Since the Conservatives.
No, I'm not saying it's society. Actually, in the Onward report, there's a very frightening uptick in antisocial behaviour and low-level crime at the end of the last decade, before lockdown. And that's something I don't think anybody in politics has got to the bottom of, because it can't be just austerity, it can't be just society. There's something going on, but there you see a sterling example of somebody actually doing something about it.
But it is falling to Alan to do it.
It's ridiculous. It shouldn't be falling to Alan. And I can explain what's at the bottom of all of this. Nature abhors a vacuum. And what we've had is horrific backlogs in our courts, which is meaning people aren't getting tried, they're not getting punished. We've seen policing rendered down to running around in rainbow costumes investigating mean tweets. They're not actually doing proper policing on the street. We've had this Americanization of public life where, as Alan pointed out, the perpetrator's rights are often put ahead of those of the victim. And so into this space, is it not a surprise that antisocial behaviour and crime is going up? It's a failure of governance, and it shouldn't be Alan having to corral other residents and his neighbours to sort this out, having to tell the Home Office how to do their job, having to tell the council how to do their job, having to tell the police to police. It should be the government at the top telling all these institutions what they should be doing.
I think it's easy. I think it's important to make it clear that it's not a complete blanket. So restructuring of Lancashire Force in the last 18 months and that's what I mean by leadership, and that's before we get the uptick in police numbers. And it's the willingness to use criminal sanctions when appropriate. It's the councils being willing to give, community behaviour orders. It's local residents being willing to speak out. And there's a job for government to make sure that policy and guidance comes through, but also to lay out the foundations. So the Safer Streets Fund that the government does, people like Alan across the country can apply for improved lighting and that kind of thing. It's doing all of those things. But anybody in the country wants to come and see what we're doing in Lancashire. It's making an enormous difference in Chorley and Leyland. It's genuinely
But
top.
isn't that where you've got a chief of police who actually said, I only, go down on one knee for my wife or the Queen?
We've got a wonderful chief constable, but the key bifurcation was when we got rid of the Labour PCC and got a Conservative.
Are you trying to say that anti-racism in the police force in some ways stops it from effectively policing?
No, that is not what I'm trying to say. No, I'm not. That's not what I'm trying to say. And I think it's very clear what I'm trying to say, which is the focus of the police should be policing. As Alan said, we're in a situation now where we're more concerned with what people might consider, these woke activist issues than we are with actually going after perpetrators and punishing people.
Taking the knee as an act of respect.
Well, why were police taking the knee in what is, some sort of imported culture war from America?
All right, I don't want to go off on a bit of a tangent, but you can make one final point, because I want to go back to Alan's laughing. I want to go back to Alan briefly. What do you make of what you have heard so far, particularly about whether it's up to you and residents or local authorities and the government to deal with this?
Well, I accept several of the comments there. One thing, we weren't going for the Home Office. We were happy with the Home Office regulations. It was just that they weren't being followed in Brighton. Now, what was the other point?
Leadership.
Well, don't worry. If you can't remember... Can you remember your last point?
Sorry?
Can you remember your other point?
Well, it was something to do with down to us. We don't mind taking responsibility, but let's be honest, not every community is blessed with a group of people that we've got. They do need help from their councils.
All right, Alan Cook, thank you very much. I'm glad you remembered that point. We're going to talk about defence. Here's the Daily Mail front page. It says, as fears grow, shrinking military will get no extra funding in budget. Generals and MPs warn that amid global crises, Britain will be left all but defenceless. The report also makes the point that we've donated a lot of military kit and equipment to Ukraine to help them fight the war with Russia. And that is a point that was made by the Shadow Defence Secretary, John Healey, to the BBC earlier. Let's have a listen.
Alongside the 14 tanks that the government sent to Ukraine, which has our full support as a Labour Party, we sent 30 big artillery guns. That's a third of all of these guns that we've got in the British Army, and we've sent those guns, but there is no order in place to replace them.
Are we defenceless, Catherine? Are there no plans to replace the military hardware we've sent to Ukraine?
I believe it's in the process. I was with some of the defence contractors the other day, enormous employers and generators of skills in Lancashire. I won't name-check them, but I'm sure you can guess what they are. I think where we are now is we are leading, along with America, the response to Putin's aggression in Ukraine. We're sending them lots of stuff, and it's taking a bit of time to buy back and replace it. And to some extent, making sure that we buy the right stuff for future wars and having a proper think about it, good. I think we need to.
Would the SNP commit to replacing all the kit and equipment that has been used in Ukraine?
Well, that wouldn't be our responsibility.
No, but I'm just saying, do you think it's important?
It's absolutely important.
Right.
I think, incidentally, I think the defenceless headline is a bit of a disservice to the over 100,000 personnel in uniform in the United Kingdom who would definitely take a different view. What's not at issue, and I'm afraid this really does predate, Catherine, the war in Ukraine, what is not at issue is the fact that the MOD's cupboard is largely bare. And when it came to donating relatively small amounts of massive capital equipment, an awful lot of ammunition to Ukraine, which has been used to extremely good effect, there is now very little left. But worse than that is the way that the MOD have systematically allowed the supply chain to atrophy over the last 20 years across both Labour and Conservative governments, so that when they knock on industry's door to say, can we have some more of these things, industry says, well, I'm sorry, we're not tooled up to do that. We'll get back to you in 2 or 3 years. Now, industry is coordinating very productively with the Ministry of Defence, but there are definite lags here. And this, as I say, there's nothing about Ukraine that has caused the absolute catastrophe, 5 billion catastrophe in Ajax. There's nothing about Ukraine means that we've got half the F-35s that we should have. There's nothing about Ukraine that means an order for 3 E-7 Wedgetail I-Star planes is a pointless order. It should be at least 7. None of that's to do with Ukraine, and most of it is to do with the fact that the Treasury views defence as a slush fund that it can wax and wane to make the government's books balance up in other departments.
Well,
and that's
but maybe
come home to roost.
Well, maybe priorities are changing, I suppose some people would say, in terms of spending. But what do you think? Are we defenceless? I mean, in the way Dave has just listed all the equipment that we are lacking or isn't going to be replaced, Labour want to boost that.
They do, and I think we'll hear from John Healey later today about this. Defenceless, no, but our job inside NATO is absolutely critical. We are one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, one of the only 3 democracies on that Security Council. We've always been the leading military force in NATO in Europe. And you cannot do that unless you can commit serious, modernised, well-equipped forces to the task now, which is deterring Vladimir Putin from attacking any of our allies. Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, has made the talisman of conservatism, the idea of a modernised war-fighting division, 3 or 4 brigades, well-equipped. He said, no, we can't put it into the field by 2030 or at all. And what does that do? It's not just about soldiers having to use dodgy kit. It's about our own status within the one alliance on which our entire security as a nation depends. So I would say I'm free of front bench, backbench politics. I would like Labour to commit to the 3% that Liz Truss committed to. Yes, and she committed to it at the UN General Assembly, not in some backwood Tory meeting. Let's commit to it. Let's show that we mean business to the people who are threatening our security.
How do you square that, though, with many of the members of the benches who were supporting Jeremy Corbyn's stance on NATO? I mean, that was an enormous threat to the alliance.
Jeremy Corbyn never at any point wanted to pull out of NATO. I'm a member of the Labour Party. I supported him, but that's not the issue. We've got John Healey, Keir Starmer leading the Labour Party now. We are the most pro-NATO of the parties, as you'll see when your own independent...
But would they commit that much? Do you think they will commit that much?
Well, that's a battle. That's a battle for every party.
Well, look, Paul's actually bang on here. When you look at what's been going on last week, a joint military operation between Russia, China, South Africa, we see that conventional warfare is alive and kicking. If we don't have manpower with the tools that they need to defend this country and defend our allies, and if the axis that is currently against the West, who's forming alliances, turn up on our doorstep, it is too late. The other thing I'm going to say is actually the UK is a leader when it comes to the defence sector. Every pound spent in R&D and defence in this country adds £7 to the British economy. It's a brilliant mass employer. We are huge innovators in this field, selling many weapons abroad as well, which gives us significant leverage on the global stage. And it's not the time right now to be caught napping and find ourselves, as the headline says,
genuinely,
defenceless.
I think I'm with David. You know, there's fantastic military personnel. There's a thing called the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme where they teach you stuff and you learn a lot. But the idea that we're stationary at the moment is not really there. We've signed a defence agreement with Japan around Tempest, which really is another massive double down of the innovation that's there.
It's also 20 years away.
It's also going to drive the technologies of the future.
So what those points about, sorry, Catherine, but those points about how innovative the United Kingdom is, that's all industry. It's nothing to do with government. They'll write the cheques at the end of the day, but nothing squares the circle of the waste from MOD.
It's government that's facilitating international
Right, but just on the figures, I mean, the Institute for Fiscal Studies have pointed out we now spend about 2% of our economic output on defence and about 9%, let's say, broadly speaking, on health. Back in the 1950s, height of the Cold War, bearing in mind we've got this land war in Ukraine, it was pretty much the reverse of that. Are we saying that that's what we should do?
One important thing, before you even get to percentages, is what you mentioned, the so-called multiplier effect of public spending. One of the problems we have in this country is that Treasury doesn't accept, like whichever Treasury, the Treasury as an institution doesn't like the idea of multiplier effects. It is sceptical about them. I think they exist. And in other words, you wouldn't have to talk about percentages if you could prove and do right industrial strategy with defence, making good all those things that you say about the defence contractors in your constituency community and the ones we've got in Scotland, which are also excellent, they add growth, jobs, skills and social cohesion to every community they exist in. But the Treasury doesn't believe in that
I
fact.
tell you what we can't ever say is that we could stand on our own in the 21st century. We have to have allies and partners around the NATO table, and I think it's important that everybody else reaches the 2%.
Well, yeah,
well
allies
ahead
and
of other
partners,
people.
America is saying you need to spend more.
And so do other NATO
and isn't that the
allies.
point
And I
of
think
NATO?
I think the Ukraine war is that wake-up call.
Collective defence is the point of NATO, but the challenge that the United Kingdom has in its chest-beating we spend the most in Europe on defence is that Germany is committed to 2%, and that's 2% of a significantly larger economy, which puts the United Kingdom out in the cold.
Right, you say it's a battle, just very briefly. Are you still wanting to become a Labour candidate?
Yes, of course I am.
Right, on that. Something completely different, a Burn Supper event in Dundee over the weekend. Alex Salmond, former SNP First Minister, now head of the pro-independence Alba Party, accused the SNP of setting back Scottish independence movement with its gender reforms. Let's take a look.
And the 6% decline in independence vote over a month. And think about that. 30 years of gradually building, till we get independence over 50% and then throw it away in some self-indulgent nonsense, which even if it was right, which it isn't, would hardly be tactically the most astute manoeuvre when you're meant to be taking Scotland to its next date with destiny.
Pretty angry, Alex Salmond. There, is he right that it's been self-indulgent nonsense in terms of your gender reforms that set back the independence movement?
No, I don't think he is right, and I can see why the Daily Telegraph wasted no time in putting it on the front page, because, of course, as a comment, it's not helpful to the independence movement. But you know, in terms of the GRR legislation passing,
this is the gender reform, gender recognition reform
passing through the Scottish Parliament. That was positive rights-based legislation which sought and tried very hard to make sure that rights were balanced equally amongst different groups. Sure. It's been taken with and run with by people who have tried to fight their own battles using that as ammunition.
But Dave, just to interject, because we haven't got masses of time, it did lead to, either directly or indirectly, or perhaps not related, to the First Minister's personal approval ratings dropping into negative territory pretty well for the first time in recent years, from +7 to -4, and support for independence falling from 53% to 47% among those expressing a view. So has Alex Salmond got a point?
No, because polls come and go. And don't let's forget the core substance of what the dynamic is in Scotland is that the SNP have been in power now for 15 years and Nicola Sturgeon is still, despite what all the newspapers would have you believe, a tremendously popular politician. Not because people like her name or how she looks, but the people like the policies that her government delivers.
All right, including the gender recognition reforms. Catherine?
I thought the sound quality on Alex Salmond was better when he was on Russia Today, if I'm honest. I think the SNP spend the entire time talking about independence. Dave's right, they've been in power 15 years. They can't handle the basics. They're over-spending this year's budget.
No, we balance our budget every year. Every year we balance our budget.
You get more money per head. Is it 1.25 compared to what we get in England?
Have you seen
You can't balance that. And then you've had a catastrophic internal row about something that is not important to the Scottish people. The SNP need to deliver better education, drug reform, and need to...
See, this is what happens with Tories. We get this in the chamber all the time. Your education is a mess. You have absolutely no evidence for that. And you've got far greater levels of social protection in Scotland. This myth that we are spending our way to difference...
You're biting chunks out of each other about an act that we've had to block, which you had legal advice. You knew it was going to conflict with UK law. We had no choice. It conflicted with reserve powers. What does that do for the people of Scotland? Never mind the women in prisons it puts under threat.
It's consistent with the Equalities Act, and also you didn't have to block that act. You chose to block it.
And will you change it? Will you amend?
Posturing over devolution.
Will you amend any of the reform bill that you've passed?
Well, that remains to be seen.
But would you like to do it?
The bill is blocked now by the UK government as a function of being in the United Kingdom. So
the bill is blocked by the fact Nicola Sturgeon's had a U-turn on it with specific cases of
And
threat.
on this issue, which will no doubt continue while we're off air, thank you to all of my guests. But I will be back tomorrow with Prime Minister's questions from 11:15. Bye-bye.